At its peak, Kellingley Colliery hauled 900 tonnes of coal per hour from 800 metres beneath the Yorkshire countryside. Today, the pit heads are demolished. The shafts are filled with concrete, and a logistics park called Connect occupies the ground where 2,000 miners once descended into the dark. For 50 years, the Big K was the largest deep coal mine in Europe, a precision-engineered fortress that broke continental production records and fed the power stations that kept northern England's lights burning. The coal didn't run out. 30 million tonnes of it still lies beneath those sealed shafts, untouched, while imported coal from Russia and Colombia burned in the power station 7 miles down the road. This is the story of how the National Coal Board froze the earth itself to build the most ambitious colliery Britain had ever attempted. How generations of Yorkshire miners staked their lives and their communities on the coal beneath their feet, and how on December 18, 2015, 450 men worked the last shift at the last deep pit in the country. Not through one disaster, through a 40-year retreat, one pit at a time, one decision at a time, until the cage stopped moving and 1,000 mines became none. Chapter 1. The Frozen Earth. Late 1950s. Coal still powered Britain, but the ground was shifting beneath it. The National Coal Board, born from nationalisation in 1947, was already closing pits in Scotland and South Wales, shuttering the worn-out seams that had fuelled the Victorian age. And yet, at the very same moment, the NCB was planning the most ambitious new colliery it had ever attempted. Not a patched-up inheritance from a private coal owner. Not a shallow drift mine scratched into a hillside. A precision-engineered descent into the earth itself, targeting coal seams 800 metres below the fields of North Yorkshire. On May 12, 1959, W.H. Sales, chairman of the NCB's North Eastern Division, laid the foundation stone. He told the assembled crowd that the board must fight back to enable the coal industry to regain its place in the nation's markets. This wasn't a man surrendering. This was a man doubling down, staking tens of millions of pounds on a hole in the ground near the small town of Knottingley, between Pontefract and the River Aire, in the heart of the Yorkshire coalfield. The NCB had reason for confidence. Exploratory boreholes sunk in the early 1950s had identified up to 7 workable coal seams at depth, including the Beeston and the Silkstone. Thick, high-quality seams that could sustain production for over a century. Planning permission was secured in 1954. The site covered approximately 177 acres. The target output was 1.5 million tonnes of coal a year, feeding the hungry power stations that lined the Erie Valley. Ferrybridge just 3 miles to the north, and in time, Drax, the largest coal-fired power station in the United Kingdom. The design was revolutionary, Europe's first all-electric colliery. No diesel machinery underground. Electric conveyors, electric locomotives, electric ventilation. Everything powered from the surface, everything controlled, everything modern. But first, they had to get down there, and the earth didn't want to let them. The top 600 feet of ground beneath the site was waterlogged. Sandy, porous geology that would flood any conventional shaft the moment it was sunk. The NCB's solution was extraordinary. Engineers drilled boreholes in a ring around each shaft position and pumped sub-zero temperature brine through them, freezing the waterlogged ground solid. Hundreds of feet of wet sand turned to ice so that men could dig through it. The sinking crews worked in sub-zero conditions, cutting through frozen earth in temperatures that turned breath to vapour and made steel tools bite the fingers through gloves. Once the shafts were below the frozen zone, a thin cement mixture was pumped through to seal the walls against water ingress. When the ground eventually thawed, the shafts would hold. The earth had been tricked into cooperating. In January 1961, the sinking team set a British record. 339 feet completed in a single month, beating the previous mark of 319 feet set at Parkside Colliery. 2 shafts were sunk to approximately 800 metres, one for men and materials, one for coal. The scale of the engineering was staggering, and the NCB knew it. Lord Robbins, the board's chairman, visited Kellingley in August 1961 and spoke optimistically about selling British coal in the European common market. The reserves beneath those frozen shafts, he believed, would sustain production for more than 100 years. 90 of those years are still there, untouched, beneath the concrete that now seals the shafts. But in 1961, that future was unimaginable. What was imaginable, what was already happening, was something just as remarkable as the engineering. Because the NCB wasn't just sinking shafts into Yorkshire, it was transplanting an entire community from Scotland to work them. The Fifeshire coalfields had been among the most militant and productive in Britain. But the NCB's own rationalisation programme was closing pits across Scotland in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The same programme that was simultaneously building Kellingley. Closing with one hand, building with the other. And the men who lost their jobs in Fife were offered new ones in Yorkshire. They came in numbers. Jimmy Miller and his extended family, brothers, cousins, uncles, brought not just their labour, but a fierce tradition of political militancy rooted in the Communist Party politics of the 1920s Fifeshire coalfields. So many Scots relocated that Nottingley earned a nickname that stuck for decades, Little Scotland. The first colliery band wasn't brass, it was a Scottish pipe and drum band. On May 5, 1965, Kellingley Colliery officially opened. Distinguished figures from the NCB and the National Union of Mineworkers attended. It was the first new pit sunk in Yorkshire since 1927. Nearly 40 years between new sinkings, and the NCB had chosen this moment, this ground, this gamble, to build the largest deep coal mine in Europe. They called it the Big K. Chapter 2. The Big K finds its voice. Production began from the Beeston Seam in April 1965, and from the start, Kellingley operated on a scale that dwarfed most of what remained of the British coalfield. The original plans had called for 3,000 workers, but modernised mechanisation meant approximately 2,000 could do the job, and do it at a pace that justified every penny the NCB had sunk into the frozen ground. The Swallowwood seam was mined in the early years, but it depleted by 1974, shifting the colliery's reliance onto the deeper, richer Beeston Seam. That transition mattered less than what the coal fed. Kellingley's primary customers were the power stations of the Erie Valley, Ferrybridge, barely 3 miles up the road, and later Drax, which at its peak generated roughly 7% of the United Kingdom's entire electricity supply. The coal moved fast, up to 900 tonnes per hour hauled to the surface from 800 metres below. A river of fuel flowing upward through rock, onto conveyors, into railway wagons, and into the furnaces that kept the lights on across northern England. The men who cut that coal were building something beyond tonnage. They were building a reputation. In November 1977, the Kellingley workforce smashed the county coalfield's 6-year-old production record. 44,136 tonnes of saleable coal in a single week. It was a statement, not just of capacity, but of collective will. These were men who understood that the Big K's survival depended on proving, shift after shift, that deep-mined British coal could compete. But Kellingley's identity was never defined by production alone. The pit's workforce carried a political consciousness that reached well beyond the coalfield fence. In 1976, Kellingley miners went on strike, not for their own wages, but in support of nurses and health workers trapped in the low-pay squeeze of the Labour government's social contract. That same year, miners from the Big K joined mass pickets at the Grunwick Film Processing Laboratory in North London, standing alongside mainly Asian women workers who'd been sacked for joining a trade union. A Yorkshire coal mine and a London photo lab had nothing obvious in common except a shared conviction that solidarity meant something. The Kellingley men drove south, stood on the line and drove home. Davy Miller, son of Jimmy Miller, the Fifeshire militant who'd helped build the colliery's Scottish backbone, became NUM branch secretary as the original Scottish cohort began to retire. The political traditions transplanted from Fife were taking root in Yorkshire soil, passed from father to son, evolving but unbroken. Kellingley wasn't just digging coal. It was building a culture, one forged in heat, darkness, danger, and a bone-deep belief that the man next to you on the face was the only thing standing between you and the roof coming down. On the August bank holiday of 1974, something happened at Kellingley that, in hindsight, reads like a scene from another country. The colliery held an open day, and members of the public descended 2,000 feet underground to see the workings of an operational deep coal mine. Families, children, ordinary people who'd never been closer to coal than a fireplace, dropping into the cage and riding it down into the dark to see what their electricity cost. It's almost impossible to imagine today. A health and safety impossibility. A liability nightmare, an insurance void. But in 1974, the NCB opened the doors and the public walked in. They wanted to see what the miners did, and the miners wanted to show them. That confidence, that willingness to say, "Come and look at what we do," was Kellingley at its most assured. The Big K was hitting its stride, production records were falling, the workforce was militant, skilled and proud. The power stations were hungry, the coal was there. And nobody standing on that factory floor in 1974, watching the cage doors open for another load of wide-eyed visitors, could have imagined that within a decade the entire industry would be fighting for its life. Chapter 3. 800 metres down. To understand what was lost when Kellingley closed, you have to go underground. Not in the abstract, not as a statistic or a line on a graph. You have to follow the men into the cage. 2 shafts, each one dropping 800 metres straight down through rock. The cage fell fast, not the gentle descent of a lift in an office block, but a controlled plunge into darkness, the daylight vanishing above you in seconds, replaced by the rushing black of the shaft walls and the smell of damp stone and hydraulic fluid. At the bottom, the air hit you. Underground at Kellingley, the temperature could climb to 30 degrees or more, a wet, clinging heat that soaked overalls within minutes and never let up. The coal face could be 7 miles from the shaft bottom, 7 miles from sunlight. Men walked, rode conveyor belts, or took electric locomotives through tunnels cut from rock, heading deeper into the seam with every step. At the face, the shearer did the cutting, a massive rotating drum that chewed into the coal seam along a face up to 250 metres wide. Behind it, powered supports weighing 30 tons each held the roof in place, advancing forward as the shearer progressed, letting the roof collapse behind them in a controlled sequence. The noise was constant and enormous. The grinding of the shearer, the clank and hiss of the hydraulic supports, the rumble of coal dropping onto the armoured face conveyor. Dust filled the air despite the water sprays. Coal dust, ite dust. The fine particulate of rock ground to powder by machinery, operating at the limits of what engineering could sustain at that depth. And beneath the dust and noise, always, the awareness of what was above you. 800 metres of rock, held in place by steel and hydraulics, and the calculations of men you'd never meet. The all-electric design that had made Kellingley revolutionary in 1965 meant no diesel exhaust underground. But it meant something else too. A constant electrical hum that became the baseline of every shift. Conveyors, ventilation fans, pumps fighting the water that never stopped trying to reclaim the shafts. The only light was what you carried on your helmet, or what was bolted to the machinery. Beyond the reach of those beams, the darkness was absolute. Not the darkness of a room with the lights off. The darkness of the earth itself. 17 miners lost their lives during Kellingley's 50 years of operation. 17 men who went underground and didn't come home. The mine was dangerous at every moment. A roof fall, a gas pocket, a mechanical failure could kill without warning. The men who worked the face understood this in their bodies, not as an abstraction. Every shift was an act of calculated risk, and the calculation depended entirely on the men around you. You trusted the deputy who'd check the roof. You trusted the fitter who'd service the supports. You trusted the man on the next chock to advance when you advanced, hold when you held. The bonds forged in those conditions were different from surface work, deeper, more physical, more absolute. These men didn't just work together, they kept each other alive. Paul Hine was a locomotive driver, 50 years old when the pit closed. His family had a 3-generation association with mining. He'd started at Woolly Colliery before transferring to Kellingley 28 years earlier. 28 years of riding the underground railways, hauling supplies to the face and coal back to the shaft. Nigel Kemp, the banksman who controlled the cage at the shaft top, was also 50 at closure. He'd worked at Kellingley for more than 30 years, left school at 16 and came straight to the pit. 30 years of lowering men into the dark and bringing them back up. Mark Bainbridge spent 32 years maintaining the miners' lamps. The lights that were the only thing between a man and total blackness 7 miles from the surface. Colin Thwaites, 52 at closure, introduced himself to a reporter as a living legend god almost. He'd been a miner for 35 years. He was also a lifeguard and a ballroom dancer. The characters bred by this work were as specific and irreplaceable as the coal they cut. These weren't men who could be replaced by a retraining scheme and a 0 hours contract at a distribution warehouse. They carried skills that had taken decades to acquire, passed through families, refined underground in conditions that no surface job could replicate. And they knew it. Chapter 4. Coal in the blood. Kellingley didn't just employ a town, it built one. Nottingley had existed long before the NCB sank its shafts, but the colliery remade the place in its own image. The population grew through the 1960s as the pit grew. Streets filled with mining families, many of them the Scottish migrants who'd come south from Fife, mixing with Yorkshire families whose roots in the coalfield went back generations. The rhythms of the town synced to the rhythms of the shifts, the early morning movement of men heading for the cage, the midday quiet, the evening return, the weekend release. At the heart of it stood the Kellingley Miners' Welfare Club, known locally, like the mine itself, as the Big K. It was the social centre of the community, the place where miners drank after shifts, where families gathered for events, where the bonds forged underground extended into the life above. The club shared its nickname with the colliery, and that wasn't an accident. The mine and its welfare club were two expressions of the same thing, a community organised around coal. The colliery band had evolved from the original Scottish pipe and drum outfit into a brass band in the Yorkshire tradition, performing at galas, competitions and community events that marked the calendar of pit village life. The clubs, the bands, the galas. These were the social architecture of a world built on the assumption that the coal would always be there and the men would always dig it. Yvette Cooper, the MP for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, the constituency containing Nottingley, would later tell the House of Commons, "Most people have coal in their blood, family who worked in the local pits or further afield." She wasn't speaking in metaphor. Multi-generational mining employment was the norm, not the exception. Fathers followed grandfathers underground. Sons followed fathers. The pit was the family business, not owned by the family, but inhabited by them, generation after generation, until the seam ran out, or the politics changed, or someone in London decided the numbers didn't work. And Nottingley wasn't alone. Surrounding the Big K was a network of pit villages, Fryston, Glasshoughton, Welldale, Allerton Bywater, Charleston, Prince of Wales, each one built around its own colliery, each one now bereft. The Selby Coalfield Complex, once the pride of the NCB's modernisation programme, was gone. Every surrounding pit had closed. Kellingley was the last one standing, the final deep mine in a landscape that had once been defined by coal. The statistics of dominance told the story in numbers. Kellingley held the title of the largest deep coal mine in Europe, earned and held across decades. In 1986, the pit achieved a record 404,000 tonnes from a single shift. Then, on September 28, 1988, the Kellingley workforce did something that nobody in the European coal industry had done before. Through coordinated shifts, minimal downtime, and the kind of collective effort that only a workforce operating as a single organism could sustain, they produced 70,262 tonnes of saleable coal in a single week. The European weekly production record. Set in a Yorkshire pit by Yorkshire miners, and Scots who'd become Yorkshire, pushing machinery and bodies to the absolute limit. The coal fed Drax. It fed Ferrybridge. It kept the lights on. 900 tonnes per hour hauled to the surface through fully mechanised longwall extraction. Shearer loaders cutting faces 250 metres wide. The most advanced deep mining technology in the country deployed in a colliery that the NCB had built to prove that British coal had a future. For a time it did. Chapter 5. The longest retreat. The European weekly record was set in 1988. 70,000 tonnes in 7 days. The greatest sustained production performance in the history of European deep coal mining. Achieved by a workforce that had spent 2 decades proving the Big K was worth every pound the NCB had spent to build it. But 1988 was also the year that the structural truth of British coal became impossible to ignore. Overall, UK coal production was already in steep decline, from 128 million tonnes in 1981 to figures that would eventually reach 17.8 million tonnes by 2009. The pit was getting better at a job the country had already decided it no longer needed doing. The European record wasn't a launch pad, it was a summit, and the view from the top, had anyone paused to look, showed nothing but downhill terrain in every direction. The forces that would kill Kellingley were already in motion. They'd been in motion for years, and they arrived not as a single blow, but as a sequence of wounds, each one survivable on its own, each one making the next one worse. The retreat had begun long before anyone was willing to call it that. Chapter 6. The picket line and the funeral. On March 12, 1984, the National Union of Mine Workers, led by its president Arthur Scargill, called a national strike against the closure programme announced by NCB chairman Ian McGregor. The battle lines were drawn across every coalfield in Britain. Kellingley was no exception. But at the Big K, the lines were not as clean as the national narrative would later suggest. Kellingley had a higher number of miners opposed to the strike than most other Yorkshire pits. This was a divided workforce. The solidarity that had sent men south to Grunwick, that had walked out for nurses, was tested by a dispute that split communities down the middle and left scars that have never fully healed. Most Kellingley miners joined the strike. On September 26, 1984, 200 striking men held a sit-in underground, occupying the pit itself as an act of defiance. In September, police organised a 24-hour guard on the home of a ghoul miner who returned to work at Kellingley under escort. One of only 2 to break the strike in the early months. From January 1985, more began to drift back. The first coal since the strike began was produced on January 8, 1985. The strike formally ended on March 3rd, and the men marched back together. But together didn't mean undivided. The wounds were internal as well as external, and some of them never closed. But the worst wound of the strike at Kellingley wasn't political, it was personal. On June 15, 1984, Joe Green, a Kellingley miner, 55 years old, was killed after being hit by a lorry while picketing Ferrybridge Power Station. The power station that Kellingley fed. The road where the coal went. Joe Green was the second miner to die on picket lines during the national strike. 8,000 miners followed Joe Green's funeral cortege from Pontefract Racecourse to the crematorium. They were led by the Kellingley Colliery Band. NUM President Arthur Scargill attended. So did Jack Taylor, and MPs Geoff Lofthouse and Bill O'Brien. A Scots piper, Gordon Queen, played Scots Lament, a sound that carried the memory of Fifeshire through a Yorkshire funeral for a man killed on a picket line 3 miles from the pit he'd worked. Scargill described Joe as a fantastic lad. 8,000 men walking in silence behind a band through a Yorkshire town for a colleague who'd stood on a road and been struck down. And then there was the child. A young Kellingley miner and his wife lost their 4-year-old son during the strike. When they approached a funeral director, they were told to seek statutory funeral benefit. The application was refused. The reason? The principal claimant, the father, was involved in a trades dispute. The benefit would only be available if he broke the strike and returned to work. The choice laid before a grieving father: cross the picket line or leave your son's body in the hospital mortuary. He didn't cross. The couple couldn't pay. Their 4-year-old's body remained in the mortuary until the Kellingley NUM branch paid for the funeral from union funds. The state had refused to bury a child because his father wouldn't dig coal during a dispute about whether the coal should be dug at all. The strike ended. The pit survived. But British deep mining did not survive as an industry with a future. It survived as an industry with a countdown. 8 years later, the countdown accelerated. On October 13, 1992, Trade Secretary Michael Heseltine stood in the House of Commons and announced the closure of 31 out of 50 remaining deep coal mines, with the loss of 30,000 jobs. British Coal Chairman Neil Clark described it as grievous. The public response was volcanic. 200,000 people marched through London in protest, the largest demonstration in over a decade. Even the Sun backed the miners. Heseltine was forced into a humiliating retreat within 6 days. 10 pits to close immediately, 21 placed under moratorium for review. But the moratorium was a stay of execution, not a pardon. The programme ground on. The industry shrank from 50 pits to a rump. Kellingley survived. It was not on the closure list. But survival in a shrinking industry meant something different from survival in a growing one. Every pit that closed around you made you more exposed. Every contract lost by a neighbouring colliery concentrated more pressure on the ones that remained. Kellingley was still standing, but it was standing in a smaller and smaller room. The structural forces were pitiless and specific. The dash for gas gutted coal's market. Privatisation of the electricity generators, national power, Powergen, meant they could choose cheaper fuel. New gas-fired power stations were built across the country. Coal contracts were not renewed at previous volumes. The maximum tonnage the generators would take fell from 65 million tonnes to 40 million. The market effectively halved overnight. Kellingley could produce 900 tonnes an hour. The question was whether anyone still wanted to buy them. And behind the dash for gas came the imports. Coal from Russia, Colombia, Australia and the United States undercut British deep-mined coal on price. The irony was savage and specific. Drax and Ferrybridge, the power stations Kellingley had supplied since the 1960s, the stations just miles away, would continue burning coal for years after the pit closed. Imported coal. Shipped thousands of miles by sea, while 30 million tonnes of British coal sat untouched beneath sealed Yorkshire shafts. The market didn't stop wanting coal, it stopped wanting British coal. Inside Kellingley, the vulnerabilities were geological as well as political. Faulting disrupted planned faces. Water ingress was constant, the same waterlogged ground the NCB had frozen. In 1960, never stopped trying to flood the workings. The Swallow Wood seam had depleted by 1974, and the pit suffered from face gaps, the dead periods when one panel was worked out and fresh tunnels had to be cut to reach the next. During these transitions, workers and equipment relocated, production halted, and the mine bled cash. Kellingley had also resisted incentive and bonus schemes, maintaining pay parity with the rest of the Yorkshire NUM. It was solidarity, the same solidarity that had driven men to Grunwick and onto the picket lines for nurses. But it also meant rigid working practices that limited the flexibility a private owner would demand. The seeds were in the ground. The question was, who would own the harvest? Chapter 7. The corner shop takes over. The answer arrived on December 30th, 1994, when the English mining operations of British Coal, 17 of the remaining 19 deep mines, 30 surface mines, over 400 million tonnes of reserves, and nearly 50,000 acres of land, were sold to a company called RJB Mining for £815 million. The man behind RJB was Richard Budge, born in Boston, Lincolnshire in 1947, the same year coal was nationalised. He'd studied fine art at Manchester University, entered the coal industry through his brother Tony's opencast company AF Budge, and in 1992 bought the opencast division for approximately £103 million. He floated RJB Mining in May 1993. When he bought British Coal's deep mines 18 months later, the press dubbed him King Coal. Budge described the purchase himself, a bit like the corner shop taking over Marks and Spencer. He wasn't wrong. He had no deep mining experience. He'd taken on 10,000 employees who had only ever had one employer, British Coal, which had itself closed more than 100 collieries in the decade between the end of the strike and privatisation. Former Energy Secretary Cecil Parkinson called it the ultimate privatisation, the transfer of a national strategic asset to the open market, completed the year before Christmas. There was a shadow over the transaction that Parliament would later examine. Budge's brother's firm, AF Budge, had gone into receivership in 1992, owing £96 million. A Coopers and Lybrand report to the DTI's insolvency service questioned the fitness of 3 former directors, including Richard Budge, to serve as company directors. On November 21, 1994, disqualification proceedings were brought against 2 of the 3. Richard Budge escaped. In a parliamentary debate on May 16, 1995, MPs raised serious questions about how this had happened, noting that Budge had met the Minister for Industry and Energy on at least 7 separate occasions during the privatisation process. The government needed a buyer. Budge was the buyer. The questions went unanswered. Initially, it worked. Profits jumped from £20 million in 1994 to £186 million 2 years later. Budge paid down bank debt. There was investment, new machinery, fresh faces opened, cultural change attempted. But in the late 1990s, coal prices fell sharply on international markets. RJB's high fixed costs, the inescapable expense of maintaining deep mines that flooded if you stopped pumping and collapsed if you stopped supporting, made adaptation difficult. Budge pleaded with the Labour government for subsidies. Tony Blair's government refused. Budge quit as CEO in March 2001, forced out by shareholders unhappy with returns. RJB Mining was renamed UK Coal. Without Budge's personal commitment to the mining workforce, a commitment that was genuine, whatever questions surrounded the original purchase, the company increasingly managed by balance sheet. Budge himself went on to acquire Hatfield Colliery, invested £110 million of his own money trying to pioneer clean coal and carbon capture, was declared bankrupt in 2013 and died in 2016. He was 69, born the year coal was nationalised, bankrupt the year before the last pit closed, dead the year after. His trajectory was the industry's trajectory, and Kellingley, the biggest prize in the portfolio he'd assembled, was now in the hands of a company called UK Coal that had neither the resources nor the conviction to save it. Chapter 8. Does not represent value for money. What followed was a cascade. Each disaster triggered the next. Each response was reasonable in isolation and catastrophic in sequence. In 2003 and 2004, the Selby Complex, a group of mines that had been among the most modern in the country, proved uneconomic and closed. A major production base, gone. In 2004, Kellingley received £7.2 million from the Coal Investment Aid Scheme, and UK Coal invested £55 million to access the Beeston Seam, expected to sustain the pit until at least 2015. The Silkstone Seam could have extended it to 2019. There was still coal. There was still a plan. But the plan needed money, and the money needed confidence, and confidence was draining away. The 2006 Energy Review offered words but not funds. The government concluded it was important to retain a strong GB mining industry, then provided no financial support, only a coal forum for discussion. A talking shop where the industry needed a lifeline. In 2008, UK Coal's share price had been buoyed by its large land holdings, potential housing development sites that gave the company a value on paper that its mining operations couldn't justify. The financial crisis destroyed those land values overnight. In 2009, a distress rights issue raised £100 million. Money that should have stabilised the company for years. Instead, a series of production failures and safety incidents evaporated the entire cash pile in months. 3 profit warnings in 6 months. The company's standing with shareholders was destroyed. The human cost of those years was written in the language of incident reports and coroner's inquests. On September 30th, 2008, miner Don Cook died in a rock fall at Kellingley. On October 18th, 2009, miner Ian Cameron died after equipment fell on him underground. On November 30th, 2010, 200 workers were evacuated following an underground gas explosion. On September 27th, 2011, miner Jerry Gibson was killed in an underground roof collapse. Another miner was injured, 3 men dead, 200 evacuated, and still the remaining workforce went back underground. Still they descended in the cage, walked the 7 miles to the face, and cut coal. Because that was what they did. Because the alternative, walking away, meant the end of everything the Big K had been. Then Daw Mill burned. In 2013, Daw Mill Colliery in Warwickshire, UK Coal's largest mine, was destroyed by an underground fire. The trigger was pulled. UK Coal Mine Holdings and UK Coal Operations entered administration on July 9, 2013, administered by PricewaterhouseCoopers. The company was restructured. Mining operations were separated from the property division, Harworth Estates. Kellingley and Thoresby Colliery in Nottinghamshire were the only deep mines left. 2 pits. The entire British deep coal mining industry reduced to 2 holes in the ground, both of them bleeding cash, both of them begging for a reprieve that nobody in government was prepared to grant. UK Coal proposed extending the lives of Kellingley and Thoresby by 3 years. The cost, £338 million. The case was made, the unions backed it, the workforce backed it, the local MPs fought for it. The NUM raised more than half of the £5 million required to keep Kellingley operating from the pockets of its own members. Miners reaching into their own wages to buy time for their own pit. On March 26, 2015, the last day of Parliament before dissolution for the general election, Business Minister Matthew Hancock issued a written statement. The funding does not represent value for money. 6 words. Issued on the last possible day, when no debate was possible, no questions could be asked, no minister could be challenged. The pit was closed by written statement. Yvette Cooper, the constituency MP, laid out the case in a Hansard adjournment debate on December 9, 2015, 9 days before the final shift. She told the House that the miners had fought for 2 years to keep Kellingley open. They'd sought alternative investors. They'd campaigned for EU state aid that could have opened new faces and accessed rich reserves. The government, she said, had deliberately delayed, pushed costs up by £120 million, and then used the inflated figure to justify refusal. Chris Kitchen, General Secretary of the NUM, called the closure another vindictive act. Keith Polson, the NUM representative at Kellingley, said the miners had felt like a convicted prisoner on death row since the announcement 2 years earlier. Phil Whitehurst of the GMB said the final 450 miners, the last in a long line stretching back for generations, were having to search for new jobs before the shafts that led down to 30 million tonnes of untouched coal were sealed with concrete. Cooper made one more point that cut deeper than any statistic. The miners, she said, had saved the government money by continuing to work. If they'd walked out, UK coal would have collapsed, the government would have lost the millions in tax the company owed, and, more importantly, it would have been landed with the bill for closing the pit. Tens of millions of pounds. The miners had subsidised their own redundancy by staying at their posts. Their severance was statutory redundancy, 12 weeks average pay. Cooper told the House it was the worst deal of any of the hundreds of thousands of miners who had left the industry over many decades. And one more door closed that same year. The government pulled the plug on clean coal technology and carbon capture and storage at Drax. The power station just down the road, the station Kellingley had fed for decades. The technology that might have given domestic coal a future was cancelled in the same political season that the last domestic deep mine was shut. Energy Minister Andrea Leadsom confirmed the severance terms without ceremony. Cooper's final observation was the one that refused to leave the room. Closing Kellingley would not cut Britain's carbon emissions by a single tonne. All it would do was make the country more dependent on imported coal. Chapter 9. Delilah. Thoresby Colliery in Nottinghamshire closed in July 2015. Kellingley was now the last one. The last deep coal mine in Britain. 450 miners working the final months of a countdown that had begun 2 years earlier and that no amount of fighting, fundraising or parliamentary debate had been able to stop. In April, the first batch of 205 workers had been given notice. By December, the end was measured in shifts, not months. On December 9th, Yvette Cooper secured her adjournment debate in the House of Commons. Her speech was a eulogy delivered while the patient was still breathing. 9 days later, the patient died. The morning of December 18th, 2015. Miners arrived for their final shifts. Morale, by every account, was at absolute rock bottom. Andrew Robinson, 51, who'd spent his working life at the Kellingley Miners' Welfare Club, said it plainly. "I'm sure it'll be emotional today and I'll shed a tear as many of these guys will, because they're some of the greatest guys I've ever met in my life." He added, "I hope we're going the right way, but I don't believe for 1 minute that we are." Nigel Kemp, the banksman, 50 years old, 30 years at the pit, put it in terms that carried the weight of a generation. People like myself, around the 50-year-old mark, they haven't known anything else. They left school and came here at 16 years old. A lot of people have transferred here from other mines. They have no transferable skills, and now they have to go out and find another job. But they will do it because we're made of sterner stuff up here. Then the cage descended for the last time, and the men inside it sang. They sang Delilah, Tom Jones, the son of a Welsh coal miner. A love song, absurd, joyful, heartbroken, belted out by 450 men in a steel cage dropping 800 metres into the earth for the last time. Every man on the cage, every voice raised. You could hear them 400 feet down, their voices echoing up the shaft as the cage fell. Nigel Kemp again. This is what makes us very special, the mining community. The men have gone down today singing My Delilah. Every single man on the cage, you could hear them 400 feet down singing. And I do believe they're going to come out singing as well. They came up singing. They came up live on television. Soot-blackened men emerging from the cage to cheers, applause and tears. Some carried lumps of coal as mementos. The last haul of coal from the pit was destined for a museum. Gary Ward, soot-covered, said what many felt. Everybody knows we've got to decarbonise and go green, we know that. But we're not ready for it. Paul Hine, the locomotive driver, 50 years old, 3 generations of mining in his family, said it with a precision that no politician matched. It's been an emotional day for all of us, shaking hands with colleagues and friends that we will probably never see again. I never thought I would see this day in my working career. I knew one day it would end, but I didn't think I'd see it. If the government announced that they wouldn't be burning coal anymore, I think we could take it better. But knowing they will be burning imported coal just down the road for up to 10 years is a real kick in the teeth. Sean McLaughlin, the mine manager. I would like to thank my colleagues for all their hard work and determination at this difficult time. Like them, I thought that I would see out my career here, but it is not to be. One miner, unnamed, simply told the press, "Done." The next day, 3,000 people marched through Nottingley. Starting at the town hall, the last miners, their families, and former miners from pits that had closed years and decades earlier walked together to the Kellingley Miners' Welfare Club. David, a local resident, watched them pass. It's just a sad day for the town and the surrounding area. Obviously, with the closure of Ferrybridge Power Station on the horizon as well, it's looking grim for the communities around the pits. My grandparents worked in the pits. The statistics of finality needed no commentary. When Kellingley opened in 1965, approximately 500,000 people were employed in British coal, producing around 177 million tonnes a year. When Kellingley closed, there were 450, the last ones, in the entire country. At nationalisation in 1947, close to 1,000 deep mines had employed 850,000 people. After Kellingley, there were none. Chapter 10. The shafts are sealed. The demolition began almost immediately. 12 steel winding ropes totalling 8,500 metres in length and weighing 36 tonnes were extracted from the shafts. High-pressure water jetting cleaned the shaft walls. Steel soffits and reinforced concrete slabs were installed to cap each shaft, with provisions for methane gas extraction. A final, faintly absurd detail. The gas that had killed men underground might yet be captured as green energy from the sealed tombs they'd worked in. Every redundant industrial structure on the surface was demolished. Both pitheads came down. The coal preparation plant. The baths where men had washed the coal dust from their skin after every shift. The winding towers that had been visible for miles across the flat air valley. Gone. Harworth Group took ownership in March 2016 and received planning consent the following year for redevelopment. The site today is called Connect, a 151-acre logistics and distribution park offering up to 1.45 million square feet of manufacturing and distribution space. Harworth sold the development site for £54 million in 2021 to Henderson Park and Cole Waterson. Small industrial units built by the Coalfields Regeneration Trust occupy 3 acres at the entrance. Warehouses and loading bays stand where the winding gear once stood. For the workers, the transition was brutal. 450 miners made redundant with 12 weeks statutory pay. Russ Keir and Ian Cunife, who'd lost their jobs at Kellingley in July 2015, spoke for many. A lot of the younger lads found work in the local power stations or steelworks. The government has just announced the closure of coal-fired power stations and 900 jobs are to go at the steelworks. How are people meant to support their families when they are living on 0-hour contracts? Ferrybridge Power Station, the station 3 miles up the road, the station Kellingley had fed since the 1960s, the station outside which Joe Green had been killed on the picket line. Closed in March 2016, 3 months after the pit. More skilled jobs from the same streets gone. David Parry, Principal Policy Officer at the Industrial Communities Alliance, put the broader picture into words that the statistics confirmed. There's not been any significant replacement of the older industries with sustainable new industry. Combined with the impact of welfare reforms, these areas have been hit disproportionately hard. UK coalfield communities make up 9% of the population. They remain among the most deprived areas in the country. A memorial statue to the 17 miners who lost their lives at Kellingley had been unveiled in September 2010, 5 years before the pit itself closed. The men it commemorated are still remembered. The pit that killed them and employed them is not there to remember them back. In November 2016, the BBC broadcast The Last Miners, a 2-part documentary based on the final weeks of the colliery. The cameras captured what the narration couldn't, the faces of men walking out of a building that had given their lives structure, purpose and meaning for decades. into a world that had no equivalent to offer them. Chapter 11. What the Silence Keeps. The last lump of coal from Kellingley sits in a museum now, an exhibit, a curiosity, something behind glass that once came from 800 metres below the surface, cut from a seam by a shearer and carried upward by men whose names will never be on the label. The memorial to the 17 dead miners stands in the open air, marking lives lost in the pursuit of something the country decided it no longer wanted. The Kellingley Miners' Welfare Club still stands in Nottingley, still open, still called the Big K. The mine is gone, but the club that shared its name survives, carrying the memory of what the mine was in a building designed for the people who worked it. Beneath the sealed shafts, beneath the concrete caps, beneath the logistics park and the distribution warehouses and the loading bays, 30 million tons of coal remain in the ground. Untouched. Unreachable now. The seams that the NCB's boreholes found in the 1950s, that W.H. Sales staked his reputation on, that the frozen earth was forced to yield. Still there. Still combustible. Still useless. Drax converted from coal to biomass. The power station that Kellingley fed for decades now burns wood pellets shipped from the forests of North America. The fuel crosses an ocean. The coal 7 miles away stays in the dark. The arc is complete, and it can be written in a single paragraph. In 1913, British coal production reached its peak. In the 1920s, over 1 million men worked underground. In 1947, nationalisation brought close to 1,000 deep mines and 850,000 employees under state ownership. In 1984, the strike. In 1992, Heseltine's 31 closures. In 1994, privatisation. In 2015, Kellingley, the last one. After Kellingley, 0. The shafts are sealed, the pitheads are demolished, the winding ropes have been pulled, the cage doesn't move, the coal stays where it is, where it's been for 300 million years, beneath the fields and the logistics parks and the small industrial units, beneath the silence that settles over a place built for noise. The Big K is quiet now.